Can you guys see my screen? Probably not.
Now we can.
Okay.
Can't now.
So brief recap of yesterday. We created the Git repo. We ended up having to use GitHub because the Azure DevOps had like a 5-person minimum or something, or maximum. We created the basic .NET Core API project. We started doing some entity framework and SQL Server setup. So if you missed any of that, go watch the video from yesterday, skim around in there. There was some good conversation there too. So today, and I got some good feedback from some folks kind of offline, and I got some interest in maybe looking at some of the Mediatr stuff, also some interest in looking at some of the React stuff. So, and then another thing I thought we could do is we do have some static code analysis tools that we could add, which would kind of like enforce our styling and just some best practices that we can add pretty simply into the project as well. So I guess we can kind of take it in like a bunch of different directions. So if someone wants to throw something out, we can maybe just kind of start there.
I guess I would recommend, personally, I would rather exhaust the stuff we do with .NET Core and the API before moving on to React, just to kind of keep those siloed a bit. So I don't know if we want to talk about some of the stuff you said, maybe Mediatr a bit,
Sure.
Anything like that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. We can kind of like maybe by the end of this call get the API kind of squared away. And then maybe if we wanted to over the weekend or whenever we decide to meet next, if people were still trying to do stuff or whatever, we could, if you were interested, go create an endpoint or two and a query or two or something like that. So before we get too far, how about we add like the static code analysis stuff into here, and then when we do that, we can see that we might get some warnings and errors that we might not otherwise get, but then generally the earlier in the process in the project you can add those kind of tools, the better off you're going to be. Sound like a plan?
Yeah, it sounds good.
So is everybody aware of what static code analysis can provide for you? I can dive into it a little bit. Ultimately, the idea there is we can have rules for kind of standard programming paradigms that we want to use, best practices, as well as styling. So Microsoft has provided a number of what they call analyzers within .NET Core, and Tom and I actually spent a bunch of time customizing it. Tom, we had a number of hours probably wrapped up in that. And because we were able to transfer some of that stuff over, I actually have them here, so we can just kind of add it into the project pretty quickly. And what it's going to do is just kind of enforce like that styling kind of things, and you'll kind of see as we add it. So let's just go ahead and maybe add that to the project. So at work, I wrote a .NET CLI tool that would do this for you, but for here, I'm just going to copy it out of one thing and paste it into here, and then we can see what that does. So for a second, I'm going to close the solution. I'm going to navigate out to the project, and I'm going to add a couple of files here. We can talk briefly about what those do. And as always, I see there's a couple people that might not have been on yesterday. If you have any questions, like I'm trying to make this pretty interactive, so just feel free to shout out. All right. So I'm going to copy these couple of files here, and kind of briefly explain what these do. There's this directory.build.props, and this is a .NET construct that exists. And if we look at this file, what it essentially does is say, I want to include in all of the projects this rule set file that I included, and I also want to include in all of the projects these NuGet packages. So what that does is it will install all the analyzers for us in any project that you might ever add to your solution. From there, there's this rule set file, which you can see there's all these rules and things that Microsoft has defined. And this is kind of what Tom and I had spent some time doing at one point, saying, whatever this rule is, it'll explain it in Visual Studio a bit better. We're going to say, we don't care about that. But for whatever this rule was, we think it's a warning. And then if it's not listed here, it's just going to be the default of whatever the analyzer would say.
So, John, at a high level, would you say you were more forgiving than Microsoft and you actually switch things to none, or did you have certain things that you definitely targeted more than Microsoft did off the top of your head?
Yeah, I would say the majority of things we probably turned off, which are things that we don't traditionally do, like the type of work that we work on. Like it was a lot of like, if you have a ton of XML comments, they all have to be in this format and everything needs an XML comment. And, if we were building like heavy library code or something, maybe you would want to turn some of those things on. And then on a number of them, we might have went the other way where it might have been a warning, but we said, that should probably be an error. That's something that, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to like ever have. So they're definitely going to be subjective. So as we go through here and we don't like some of them, we can turn them off. So this is just kind of like a starting point that you can get like when you're back in the fence. But then, tweak it to your project for sure. Good question, though. And then the style cop JSON is just some rules to style cop is the styling analyzers. And some of these things are kind of just goofy out of the box. So this just says like, if you have your using directives, by default it wants to be like inside the namespace, which is just really not how anybody does anything. So that's just saying like, no, don't do that. So we'll see that as soon as we open the solution again. So if we come back to our app, it might take a second for it to pull in those NuGet packages. So we'll give it a second. But it should show up in both of our projects. So you can see how these rule set files showed up here. And then in changes, you're going to see that they're here. So I'm going to start a new branch for this. And we'll just call it continue working, because I'm not exactly sure what all we're going to be doing in here. So once that's done, we should be able to see the dependencies and packages, and you can see these analyzers that are here now, the FX cop analyzers and the style cop analyzers. You can drill in here and you can look at like code quality analyzers. I'm trying to find. They're not all expanding for me like I would expect. Maybe they're not installed yet. Yeah, so here's some good ones. So you could see all of these code quality analyzers that it had installed here. Exceptions should be public, whatever, And you can right click on these and say set severity and do all, set them to whatever. So Tom and I spent some time walking through here, setting some of these up. Any questions on that? So what that means is when I build this and I look at my error list, I can see, here's some things that that it's kind of barking about, right? So of course I closed the clicked the wrong button there. So for whatever reason these aren't stored as UTF-8. I'll come back and fix some of these later. So here's one. It's saying member configure does not access and can be marked static. So potentially we could make that static. Now in this case I'm not necessarily sure we can. But as we go through, I think you'll see some of the warnings that might pop up as we're coding. So we'll go fix those maybe at a later point, but they're just there now. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So I'm going to create a commit for that. And one thing I want to just briefly talk about before we go on is Ryan was setting up this project on his Mac, and he ran into a couple of issues with SQL Server not being able to work on there. So I didn't know if anybody else had a Mac or ran into this, but he ended up spinning up SQL Server within a Docker container to run this, and it seemed like that wasn't too big of a deal to do. I can, if Ryan has any more to say on that, feel free. But what we did end up doing was he submitted a PR for the app settings rules, because we have app settings development, which gets checked into source control. And this is where our connection string is. And this is where like our path for our logs and things are. And that wasn't going to work for him. So we ended up creating an app settings local. So this was a pretty good idea. So here, if you have this local file, it's added to the git ignore, so it can never be pushed back into source control. You can have whatever connection string you want. You can override any of these settings that you want within here. And then in order to accomplish that, what we did was added a add local app settings extension method. So then in this current configuration, remember we needed to build this out for the logging. We can now just say add local app settings, which is just going to add another one of these JSON files if it exists. We marked it as optional. And then the other kind of like little piece of magic here was when we need to pass that data to startup as well. So that's where we read out that connection string. So we can just say, make sure that local app settings is also passed into startup. So at that point, when it's passed into startup, it becomes part of this configuration. And then when we go to say get connection string Foxhound connection, it's going to pull it out of the local instead of anywhere else that it finds it. So any questions on that? Any other further comment on any of that stuff? Cool. So what do you think? You want to maybe add, we'll maybe add Mediatr to this next?
Yeah, I had one quick question, John.
Sure.
The props file that incorporated the style cop stuff and
Yep.
the other static code, is that something you have to add to the solution explicitly, or just because it exists in the folder, it knows what to do?
Yeah, so it's a special file type in name.
That's what I thought. Okay.
And ultimately what it allows you to do is add some, like whatever you want that would normally just go into the CS proj files, but without explicitly having to go add that to all the CS proj files.
Okay, yeah, I haven't had much use of that yet, but I saw it and didn't really see it associated in any other files, so I imagine it was just pulled in automatically. But okay, thanks.
It's kind of an obscure thing that .NET offers, but it's really nice for stuff like this, where maybe today we'll add a test project, like a unit testing project, and it will get all the same rules just by default, which is kind of nice. Any other questions? All right. So why don't we go ahead and add Mediatr to the project? So I guess before we do that, we can kind of talk about what Mediatr is. And others might have even more knowledge on this if, so feel free to chime in. But Mediatr is a pattern that essentially allows you to kind of use CQS, which is like command query separation pattern, which means you can separate your read logic from your write logic. So the idea is you have queries that don't change state of your system, and you have commands that do change state in your system. And what we'll do is we'll kind of architect our app to know what's a query and what's a command. There's some benefit in doing that. From one that we don't run into very often, but could be scaling issues. You could potentially have all your reads come from a different database, right? Because something probably like 90% of most apps are going to be like read only, and then only a certain subset of people can actually write and create data in that app. Obviously, it depends on what domain you're working in, but that would give you that kind of ability. It also just kind of keeps a very clear, clean separation of the states of your system, which are really nice. So you can end up seeing, hey, well, what can this feature in my app, what can I do? And you can quickly look in there and see, maybe get by this or find all or something like that. And then you have your commands like add this or set this as disabled or mark this as done. So that gives you that really nice separation between what your app does, and then it also gives you some nice discoverability for somebody else coming in to look at your app and seeing and very quickly understanding kind of what this application is meant to do and what it can do. And anyone have anything else to add to that? I know a number of you have used the pattern in one way or another.
I would just add it gets you away from the service and manager type classes that you probably commonly use, right?
That's a great point. So I've been guilty of that for years. Some of you have probably worked on projects with me doing that. You end up with like a customer service, and then you have a a widget service. And then it's like, well, what happens when the widget and customer intersects? Does it go in the widget service? Does it go in the customer service? And then this kind of takes that ambiguity out of it. It's just, what's the action happening? What's the command that's taking place? It's a good point, Tom. So why don't we just go ahead and add it, and then just kind of maybe ask some questions along the way. So what I'm going to do is start just by adding a NuGet package. So Mediatr is that pattern. There's a project called Mediatr as well that we're going to add. So it's just Mediatr. Yeah. So we're going to add Mediatr. That doesn't look right. It's this one. And we're going to install it into the app project. And then in the web project, we're going to add this dependency injection one. So what this is going to allow us to do is Jimmy Bogart, the author of this, added a really nice just hook for the dependency injection with .NET Core. So you could just add like a one-liner for it to find all your Mediatr commands and queries. So we'll look at that in a little bit more depth as well. So for now, I'm just going to install these two things. Okay. So the first thing that I'm going to do is in the app project. So we do have, I want to make sure like we have something that we can go do. So we have this Git blogs, right? So this is a pretty simple and trivial example, but we're going to start with it anyway. So what I would probably do back in the app project is if I'm going to have a feature within my app that's going to be blogs, I'm going to create what's called a feature folder for it. So I would probably just call this blogs. And then within blogs, I can create the different things that I want. Now, I've done this a number of different ways over the years, and there's not necessarily a right way or a wrong way. I've seen it done where in blogs you might have like a commands folder and a queries folder. If you don't have that much stuff, you might just kind of have folders in here that might be, create blog or get blog or whatever. So it's kind of up to us. So does anybody have an opinion one way or the other on how we want to do it for this training app?
I guess that would depend on how many different queries or commands we would be, kind of running. Like, right. Are we anticipating that there's going to be like a lot of different commands versus queries?
That's a good question. I mean, what can a blog do? You could probably create it. You could probably edit it. You might be able to like it. You might be able to delete it. You might be able to add a post to it. You want to get it. You want to get a bunch of them. So, knowing that we don't know that, maybe we'll just start it simple, and then if we find the need to refactor, we'll refactor.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
So what I'll do now is I'll create a new folder, and we'll just call this Get Blogs, maybe, or All Blogs. Get All Blogs. And we'll add a couple of classes in here. So the first one being a Get All Blogs query. And here it's going to be public, and then what Mediatr gives us is this idea of an iRequest. And so I have an iRequest, and I have an iRequest of T, which is generic. So I'll also, because we don't want to return our domain objects directly back to the UI, I'm just going to create a dummy class just called, I don't know, blogDTO or something like that. Again, we can come back and, or we'll call it a blog result. How about that? So a blog result might have very similar properties to the blog right now. I'm just going to kind of copy this, but we can come back and change this up in a little bit. So for now, we know we have a blog ID and owner and a created date. There's some tools like AutoMapper that can help you out with this as well, but for now, I'm just going to kind of do it by hand. So here we have a blog result. So what do we want our query to return? Well, we probably want an iRequest of a list of blog result. And this is also where we would have any parameters that this query would need. So in this case, we don't really need any parameters, but maybe we'll write another one here in a minute that's like get by ID, in which case, maybe it just returns a blog result and it takes a blog ID or something like that. You guys with me so far?
Yep.
So now we have this iRequest of list of blog result. So what we want to do is create a handler for that. So I'm just going to create a separate file called get all blogs query handler. And at this point, I'm going to do public iRequest handler, and it wants two things. What is the query, which is going to get the get all blogs query, and what's that result? It's going to be a list of the blog result, and then we'll use ReSharper to implement the handle method that it requires. So ultimately, what we've done here is we've said, okay, when I call query, it's going to end up in my query handler, and I'm going to end up in this code right here. So for now, let's just maybe we can see if this works. We'll just return a new blog result, and I need to give it an owner. But I need a list. Sorry, bear with me just a second.
Got a extra. Yep.
Yeah, I can't do that. I just need because it's a task. And then we'll just wrap this in a. This isn't what you would normally want to do, but just for this example, we'll do this right now. So this is just going to return a dummy list for us. In a second here, we'll come back and we'll plug in the database to it for something real. So then at this point in our controller, so we had this weather forecast controller. I'm just going to create another one called blog controller. And I don't want any of this stuff. I don't want that. I don't want that. Just a little bit of cleanup. Okay. So what we want to do here is we want to use dependency injection to inject an iMediator, and we'll call that mediator. And then within our get blogs method, we want to say we're going to get a result, and we're going to await mediator.send, and this is where you can pass it. If you can see the signature for it, it can take any iRequest of tResponse. So if you remember what our get all blog query looked like, it's an iRequest of list of blog result. So in here, oh, I copied this to the wrong thing. Bear with me. I opened the wrong file when I was editing that. So we should be better. So what I want to send at this point for get blogs is a new get all blogs query. So now my result is going to be that list of blog result, and here I can just return that result. So that keeps your I'm going to change this too. So this is now no longer going to be the blog, it's going to be the blog result. So that keeps your controller methods all very, very thin and very clean. So again, thinking of like the API project is just kind of the front door in there. Those technologies change quite a bit, but you want your back-end app to kind of be your business logic and maybe withstand a couple of iterations of whatever the API versioning and changes there might be. So when we would go to call this, what's going to happen is, it's going to get into our get blogs method. It's going to say Mediatr send. It knows what query it's going to send. That query is defined here by a list of blog result. And then our handler is going to kick in to say, accept this request, do whatever I need, and eventually return whatever the T is. In this case, it's a list of blog result. Any questions up until that point before I kind of wire it up?
Nothing here.
Cool. So the other thing that we need to do is tell the DI container how we're going to resolve all of these Mediatr queries or commands. So in this case, in startup, we need to add it to the configure services. And this is why I added that dependency injection NuGet package. That was this one. And what that allows me to do is just say services.add Mediatr. And it does need to know where the assembly is that all of the Mediatr queries are going to live in. So for now, I'm just going to do that pretty simply, just by saying assembly.load and give it the name of that assembly. So we might come back and change that later, but now it's just going to be foxhound.app. So that's going to say, go look in foxhound.app, find any, essentially any classes that have I request of T or I request, and wire up all of the dependency injection for us. So that one line is pretty powerful. But it's nice that it's kind of all abstracted from us. So assuming I didn't screw anything up there, we should be able to run this and get our result. So let's see what happens. And if someone saw I made a mistake, speak up. So what we need to do, blog/get blogs. And it didn't work. It's blog/blogs. Maybe we'll change it. So there it is. That was what was returned out of our Mediatr query. So now what we can do is go plug in the actual database call that we used to have in the controller, and then just have that, the sole responsibility of that query is to go do whatever it needs to do to get that data. Does that make sense?
Yep.
It's good.
So what we'll do now is we'll delete that. I am going to just change this up a little bit. We're just going to call this, just going to kind of put this back to action, and we'll just call this, maybe get all, something like that. So it'll be blog/get all. So back in our query handler, yesterday we set up all the dependency injection we needed to get an iFoxhound data, right? So I'm going to inject that into this query. And instead of doing all of this, I'm actually going to go get the result of that. So I'm going to say blogs equals foxhound data.blogs.toListAsync. And I can pass it that cancellation token. And then I want to return trying to think the best way to do this. I think I'm just going to do it in one line for here. So I can do blogs, and I can do select, and I can do a new blog result, and I just need the owner. In fact, that's probably wrong. We probably want to get the actual ID and the created date from it. So I'm going to do int. This is back in the blog result. We'll do blog ID, owner, created date. And then instead of setting that, we'll just set them here. So then back in our handler, we can just pass that piece of data in. So it's going to be the blog ID the owner, and the created date. So let's see if I can maybe style that to look a little better.
I think you're going to need an await there as well.
Yep, good call. And then because that's await, this needs to be async. And then what we can do is return blog. So this blog is going to be a list of blog results. So I'll be explicit about it here. So any questions on that? Any questions on like what we did there? And we've done two things in kind of one step here. We're saying go get it from the database, do a projection into the blog result just to select those, and then toList async, which is going to execute that, and then return those blogs. So if we got that right, if we spin that back up, I think I change it to blog/getAll. And now we've gone to the database to pull the two things that I had in the database. So that's like the gist of the query section of that. It's not too bad, but you get a lot of added benefit of just kind of being able to briefly open this, and you can envision all of your commands and queries here and just kind of see what your system does. The other benefit is most of the things that you do in your system can potentially be additive, assuming you don't actually have to go change the implementation of get blogs. But kind of contrasting that with like the service methods or service patterns, you might have 40 methods in your service handler or your service class, and you're going to modify that entire service class, which may break other things in that service class. This, you're isolating all of your logic into these pretty small, little, easily maintainable handlers. So that's a pretty good benefit. So where do you guys want to go from here? Do you want to add? Do we want to write another query? Do we want to try to write a command for it? Do we want to maybe add some unit tests around what this thing is doing? Kind of take it wherever you guys want to go.
I think maybe an easy command makes sense just to get one of those in there as well.
Sure. So maybe just a simple create blog.
That makes sense.
So we'll call create blog. And in this case, we're going to have a create blog command. And I'll call this public create blog command, and it's just going to be of type iRequest. And what are the parameters that this command needs? Well, we need the owner. I think that's the only thing that we need. So I'm just going to say public string owner get set for now. And we'll initialize this to string.empty. And now our handler for that is going to be an iRequest handler of create blog command. And then we'll implement the handle method. So notice how it does return this thing called unit. There's a good write-up on why they did that. I'm not going to get into all that right now, but for your commands, you essentially always want to return unit.value, and that'll just say, hey, the thing is done. But for now, what we're going to do is we're going to create a constructor. We're going to add our iFoxhound data. Going to add a read-only field for it. And here, what we can do is we want to create a new blog. So it would be just blog equals new blog, and we need an owner. Well, where do we just get that owner from? It was on the command itself. So that gets passed into this handle method for us. So we can say request.owner. So remember, creating a blog, we pass it an owner, and it's going to set the ID to 0, set the owner to whatever, set the created dates, and add an empty list of posts. So back to our command handler, now that we have a blog, we should be able to say foxhounddata.blogs.add blog. I'm going to make this an async method, and I'm going to say foxhounddata.saveChangesAsync, passing it the cancellation token. And I also need to await that. So pretty simple example, but you could envision, your some sort of business logic here, some sort of conditionals that you might need to do based on the command properties passed in. But we'll keep it simple to start. So let's find a good way to call that. So now that we have the command handler here and the command in place, in our blog controller, we will make another method that'll be a post. We'll just make it the action for now. We can come back and make this better in the future. This is going to be a task of just a task, and we'll call it create. And it's going to accept, for now we're just going to have it accept our create blog command. We'll just call it command. And at this point, we should just be able to say await mediator.send, and I'm just going to send in the actual command itself. So we're going to kind of leverage the ASP.NET Core model binding to model bind the owner into this. It's going to get that entire command, and we're going to pass that entire command along to Mediator. Because that command is an iRequest, and it's called create blog command, and we have a request handler that is of create blog command, our breakpoint or our code execution path is going to end up in here. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So now we got to find a way to kick off that command. So I'm going to get a product called service state if I don't already have it in here. I don't. I'm just going to add this because we don't have any kind of UI yet. So I'm just going to add this extension, and I'm going to navigate there. Okay. So what do I have to do to get started on this? Quick request. Sure. So this is like Fiddler if you've ever used it, but a Chrome extension, and this is one that we also have at work. So I'm going to paste in the path that I want to call, or the route that I want to call, which is going to be blog/create. And I want to give it some raw JSON data, and it's going to be owner, colon, I think I have to put these in quotes, owner, Tim. So now if I send that, well, here, I'll tell you what, we'll set a breakpoint in here and make sure that we're hitting this. We'll put a breakpoint here, and we'll put a breakpoint here so we can see what's actually happening. So I should be able, if I got this right, I should be able to send. And here we are. Our command is going to be populated with owner Tim. We're going to call the send. We're going to end up in here. We're going to create a new blog. So our blog at this point has a blog ID of 0. We got the created date, owner Tim, post 0. The nice thing, and this is an entity framework construct, after we call save changes async and we go inspect our blog again, you'll see that the blog ID was filled in for us. So that's an entity framework construct for us because it's tracking that key. And that key is a SQL Server identity column. And it's the third one that we've entered. So if I go ahead and continue, all of that should work fine. And then if I go back to say get all blogs, we should now see a third one for Tim.
Hey, John, question.
Yep.
I know you said you don't want to get into it, but I'm going to ask anyways. What is the thought? Yeah, because in a lot of cases, when you create something, if something is generated on the server, like an ID or anything else, then you have to go requery for that data to get it.
Oh, are you okay? So, are you saying like in this case, perhaps we would want to actually return the blog ID?
Yeah, the blog ID or the whole blog, whatever the case is. A lot of times, the ID is the most common case of something that's generated on the server that you would need in your user interface or whatever it is.
Yep. No, that's a great
what's
point.
the reasoning?
Yep. So the unit dot value is truly if like the method is more or less considered void, right? Now in like a perfect world, your commands would be void, but Jimmy Bogart, the guy who wrote the library himself, he has a couple really good blog posts on this, and he goes into like you got to do what's practical, and in this case, I would still call this a command, but actually return the blog ID for it. So I mean, that's a very real thing that I do, pretty much every time I run into a situation like this. So let's just refactor that quick in order to return the blog ID. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it just sounds like if you need to return something, you can.
Yeah. So we'll just make our create blog command. I request of int, and then this will now be a I'm going to return int. I'm going to return a task event, and instead of returning that, I'm just going to return the blog ID. And then down in our blog controller, what we would want to do is, int blog ID. That's what's coming out of this thing. This is now going to become a task event, and I'm going to return the blog ID. So if we come back and let me spin this back up, and we'll come back to our service state method, and we'll add one for Tom. So if we send this request, we should see the response come back and see how it's number 4 here. So kind of mixing the idea of the commands and queries there a little bit, but that's a very real practical take on that. It's still very much a command. You're still very much changing the state of the system. But you just want to get that ID back, probably for like a UI reason, right? You want to get that back so you can then maybe go to it or something, like immediately, or at least have a link to it.
And the other option there would be to do send it with an ID with a GUID, right? That would be strictly a command, and then you'd have like a read to pull the like human readable format out of the ID.
Yep.
Not super practical, but
yep. There are a couple of different approaches to that. I've found that this one seems to be the most kind of just pragmatic solution to it. Doesn't really violate a whole lot of stuff. You're still separating out your reads and your writes.
I got a good article on that I'm going to post in the chat here in a second.
Oh, good. Is it the Jimmy Bogart one?
Nah, it's a Mark Seaman.
Okay.
Post. Yeah.
So what do you guys think of that? Is that a pattern you've used? Is that something you're, we can certainly talk more like about the uses of it, things like that.
I think that's a good start.
Okay. So where do you want to take it from here? I mean, that's kind of Mediatr in a nutshell. I guess one interesting thing we could do is talk about Mediatr pipelines and logging, because that's actually a pretty nice thing that you can get for free.
Would that also maybe lead into, I don't know if you're going to talk about fluent validation, would kind of that lead into that as well?
Yes, we can do that as well. Yeah, we can certainly do that as well. So let's talk about the pipelines that you can do in Mediatr. So Mediatr has the idea very similar to the .NET Core pipeline, in the idea of you can handle when these requests are being called, you can handle things that happen while that's being called, before it's being called and after it's being called. And the easiest way to probably demonstrate that is with a logger. And this is something I've done in every app that I've used Mediatr in, because what it allows you to do is see who called which command or query when, and exactly what they passed to it, which is really nice from like a debugging perspective. When somebody comes to you and says, hey, I didn't do that, you can open the logs and say, yeah, I see that you did that on this such and such date, and here's the exact data that you passed. So let's go ahead and write that quick. It shouldn't take more than maybe like 10 minutes. So I'm going to add a folder here, and we'll call it utility. And we'll add a class in here, and we'll call it logging pipeline behavior is what Mediatr calls these. They call them behaviors. So we want a public behavior that's going to be of type tRequest, tResponse. It's going to be pipeline behavior. So this is a built-in Mediatr interface that they give us, which is going to be of tRequest, tResponse. And then since I have that, I need to implement the handle method for the actual pipeline behavior. So just like before, I want a constructor, but instead of maybe injecting our data, I want to inject a logger. So I'm going to inject an iLogger, and I'll just do an iLogger of tRequest, so whatever the request coming in is, and I'll call that the logger. I'll add a private backing field for it. And then what you can do in here, if I didn't do anything else but just say what I could actually do is just say await next, because I'm going to make this async as well. Next is the request handler delegate passing in. This is ultimately, you can think of this as getting into your handler, whether it's a command handler or query handler. When you call next, it's going to execute that. So what this allows us to do is do something like logger information, and we can say something like executing, and this is actually where we can use some of the Serolog logging, which is really nice too. We can say like request name, and I'll explain this in a second, with maybe request data, and we'll say at request. And then I can pass in a list of the properties that I want to fill here, like the parameters for that. So the request name is going to be the type of the tRequest, so whatever that is, .name. So in this case, it would say get all blogs query or create blog command. And then I can just pass it the request itself, and Serolog will serialize that for me into this string. So when I were to call, if I were to call the create blog command with the owner, we should see executing create blog command with request data owner equals Tim, or whatever we pass in. So in this case, then we would want it to go do the next thing, but in this case, I'm just going to store that into a variable for right now, just called response. And then I can say, after we've called it, I can say log information, and I can say I actually executed the request. And this would be the same, the type of tRequest .name. And then we want to just return the response at this point in time. So what's going to happen is it's going to get here, log this, get into our command handler, do whatever that's going to do, and then when it comes back out and it's finished, we're going to run this code. So this one's probably about as basic as a pipeline behavior that you're going to see. If we do plug in like Fluent validation or something, we can do some interesting stuff with the validators here too.
Hey John, have you seen any other, more common pipelines used with Mediators? Or I really can't think right now off the top of my head what functionality you could add outside of like logging and validation. Is there anything that you see commonly used in examples or other applications you're using?
So one that I wrote when we were still in the office was an authorization pipeline behavior. So the app I had was like pretty self-contained, like it was not too big, but I had the idea of admin requests, or like admin actions and non-admin actions. That's like as simple as the app was. So what I did was I just created my own interface. This is maybe a little bit more advanced, but I just had like an admin request and an I user request that both just inherited or implemented I request. And then like this command could have either said I user request or I admin request. And if it was any of those things, I could have an authorization pipeline behavior just check, okay, if I'm getting an I admin request, is the logged in user an admin? If so, go forward. Otherwise, throw some sort of valid or some sort of unauthorized exception.
Okay, that makes sense.
I don't know. Does anybody else on the call have any interesting things that they can think of that might work there? All right. So the last thing that I need to do is just kind of register this logging pipeline behavior with the DI container. So that is relatively straightforward. It's going to be services. We're going to add it as a transient, I think, because I just need it. I want one every time that this is called. I'm going to say it's a type of I pipeline behavior. And we're going to use what's called an open generic here. And then anytime I get a I pipeline behavior, I want a logging pipeline behavior. I think I got that syntax right. It doesn't think I got that syntax right. What am I missing, guys? I'm missing something stupid. One of these. Let's see, I need add transient. I need that to be a method type of. One more parent. Sorry, just a kind of goofy syntax. But you're just saying this open generic. So anytime I get an I pipeline behavior that accepts two parameters, two generics, I want the actual logging pipeline behavior that has two generics. So that's just what the signature of this looks like. One interesting thing to note there is if you do have multiple of these, the order that they're registered in is the order that they'll execute in, which can be important if you want logging before authorization or before validation or something like that. So if I got all that right and I come out here and I run this, let me go find my log. I think we have it here, so I'm just going to open this in Notepad. So we have starting. That looks like that's about now. So when let's go ahead and add another one of these. We'll add one for Kevin. Send request. And then we'll flip back over here and call get all. And we'll come look at our log. And now we can see executing create command, create blog command with request data owner Kevin. And then here it says it finished. And then I called the get all blogs query. So I mean that's like a really, it's like 10 lines of code to get logging if you use the Mediatr pattern for like any command or query within your system, which is pretty powerful. That's saved us a work a couple of times when I won't mention any names, but somebody went into one of our test financial systems and added some money during testing, and they were trying to like make sure all the numbers added up, and we were off by like whatever amount of money. We were able to come in here and find exactly who added that and for the exact amount of money. So it gave us like a nice warm fuzzy that like our testing and everything was working fine. Any questions on that?
I guess you mentioned for the ordering when you're adding it in as a service. Based on the logging, it logged when it was coming in. It then passed it off to the handler. It then logged it after the handler was done. Based on that ordering, if you had two, would it do pipeline 1 entry, pipeline 2 entry, handler, pipeline 2 leaving, pipeline 1 leaving? Is it kind of like a back and forth type thing, or?
Yeah, but keep in mind they're async as well, so you're not
That's
necessarily going to be guaranteed the order in that case.
Gotcha. Okay.
But you will be guaranteed the order that the pipelines get triggered as they are triggered through here.
Okay.
But not like if you were to send off multiple requests at a time, I don't think you might see some interesting stuff like, and you will actually, especially if you have multiple users in the system, right? You might get like 3 or 4 things executed at a time, and then you can kind of see when they finished. So I guess in that regard, it's not like foolproof, but one thing that we didn't do here because we have anonymous authentication on is you can add what's called enrichers in Serilog. So I've written like a username enricher. So every time one of these gets logged out, it'll put like the principal name in there. So like, you can see your user ID. And then you can start matching these things up, like John called executing at this time, and then it finished for John at this time. But that line might be like way further down the logs. Good question. Anything else? Delete that. Actually, I'm just going to delete this whole weather forecast controller. I don't think we need it. So I'm going to add a commit here for added Mediatr. Traditionally, the Git commits might not be that big, but so what next, guys? We got about an hour. Has that been informative up into this point? Do you want to dive deeper into any of those concepts? Do you want to try to build something out that's a little bit more complicated than just kind of a simple add and Git?
One thing I've personally haven't come through yet is unit testing, especially when you're returning like unit value and the syntax needed to validate that your expectations were met in terms of unit testing when it's a void mediator handler, if you will.
Yep.
I don't know if anyone else is interested. That's something I wouldn't mind covering if we have time.
Yeah, I mean that's not a problem at all. So there's a couple of different ways we can handle this. We can pretty quickly write a couple of unit tests for these. And what we'll do is, because we're using Entity Framework, it provides an in-memory database provider, so we can set that up pretty quickly to use that. Let me just think the best way to go about doing that. Yeah, I don't think that should be too bad. Let's do that. Does that sound good for everyone else? You want to get into some unit testing?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Okay. So what I like to do is I like to add a solution folder just called tests, and then I can nest projects within the solution folder, and that just kind of keeps the tests out of the way when I don't really care about them. But what I'm going to do is add a new project. I'm familiar with MS Tests. I know some others. I'd actually like to get to know some of the XUnit stuff a bit better, but I'm just not as familiar with some of that. I don't mind trying it, but you might watch me fumble around a little bit with it.
I mean, I think you're going to feel pretty much at home with it, honestly.
Okay, as long as someone doesn't mind helping me through some of the syntax to get started, we can do that.
Kind of off topic, John, but have you had any updates or anything from Jeff Citron about like the test coverage results and stuff from automated builds, or is that still something that's just not working?
He never got back to me on it at all. Myself and somebody actually outside of IT that had the same problem, and I mentioned our issues, and I just never heard anything more.
I miss the pretty charts and
it's
graphs. Yeah.
That's kind of nice to have. So all right, we'll create a XUnit test project, and what I would do is I would call this foxhound.app.tests. So I'm going to add a couple of NuGet packages to this to help us with this testing. So the first one is going to be Entity Framework Core in memory. Microsoft Entity Framework Core. Need to be on the Browse tab. in memory. So what this will allow us to do is, instead of using SQL Server, every one of these tests will have its own little in-memory database. So we don't have to go to the database, and we can kind of abstract that out of the way. So we'll install that. Say OK. Say accept. I'm going to add a product called Fixture, which is really nice. It's called Auto Fixture. And then there's something called Auto Mock for that. So I'll explain that in a little bit more detail as well. But this is going to bring in Auto Fixture and Mock for us. So install that. And I think that's all I'm going to need for right now. We'll start there. If we need more, we'll come back and add them. So then for my unit test itself, I would probably call this, we'll start with the get all blogs one, because that'll be a little bit easier. I would probably call get all blogs query handler tests. Sure. And then I'd actually probably create a folder that kind of matches this, so I just call it blogs. And we can debate whether that's the best or not, but get all blog, and I'll just kind of move that in here. And then we'll adjust the namespace for it. So what you would generally want to do is call this, well, let's talk about for a second what we're going to test. What we want to test is that given there are some blogs in the database, that it pulls them all back, converts them to this blog result, and returns, returns those mapped appropriately. Does that make sense?
Yep.
So we'll pin that, and we'll pin that, and I'll just kind of close the rest of these. So what I would definitely, or how I would name these, and we can talk about naming too, is since the method here is called handle, I would probably call this handle get all blogs, and then maybe we'll just start by returns correct count, so something along those lines. And then there's 3 steps to a test. So you would have like an arrange step, and the actual action or the act, and then what you're asserting here. So I think the first thing that we're going to want to do is create the data object. So like the Foxhound data. So what I need for that, I want to make sure, like if I start walking through this and things get confusing, just yell out, because I know everybody's kind of at a couple of different levels probably here. So what I'm going to do is I want to create a bunch of, well, I want to create the database first. So what do I need? I need a Foxhound. Oh, I need to add the reference to the project. So it just needs a reference to the project that it's testing, so it has access to all of that. So I want a Foxhound data, and we'll just call this let's call it data for now. And we can say this is a new Foxhound data, and see how this needs a DB context options. So one thing we can do is just create one of those. So I'm going to do var. So var DB context options equals, what is this, new DB context options of Foxhound data. And then, so in the startup, what we did yesterday is said use SQL Server, but here we want to say use in-memory database. And why is that not popping up? Because this needs to be a builder, I think. Sorry if I'm struggling with it just a little bit. I think that's going to be use, in-memory database. And then since this is going to run every time, we need to give this database a database name, and we want that database name to be unique for every method that we run. So what I'm going to do is just create a new GUID. So I'm just going to do GUID, new GUID, cast that to a string, and that's going to be the option. So this is just going to create a new database with some dummy name, but we know that name's going to be unique. And then here I should be able to pass in the DB context options. I don't care that it doesn't call out disposable right now. Any questions on that? So we now have our database that we have here. So what we want to do is create a bunch of blogs and add them to that database, right? So this is where fixture can come in for us. So I want to say var blogs equals, so I need to set up fixture, so that's going to be var fixture equals new fixture. And I want to set up a couple of things with this. I want to customize it to be a new auto. Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's auto mock. Anyone remember that? I think it's that. And this is just going to be able to mock out anything that I need to mock out as we go. Tom, there in XUnit, there's no idea of a test in it, is there?
No, you just use the constructor.
Oh, okay. So I can do all that in the constructor.
Yep.
All right. I'll circle back and refactor it when we write the next test. So that's good to know. I'll try to be very explicit here on what we're doing. So what we're going to do at this point is say fixture dot create. I can actually do a create many. I think create many, and I can say blog. I'm going to explicitly list it in this case. But what this will do for us is blogs is now a list of blog, and it's just going to be, it's going to call this constructor for us and just put in a dummy owner. So by default, when you call create many, you get 3, but there's a parameter here that I can give it the count that I would want. So I could say like I want 5 of them. So now we just have a bunch of dummy blogs. Like I don't necessarily care what they are. I just know that I have a bunch of them. Make sense? And now what I want to do is add those blogs to the database. So I have, I'm going to call this Foxhound data. Foxhound data. So I have Foxhound data, and I get blogs, and I can say add. I probably actually just do an add range, and I'll add the blogs. And then just like anything else, I'm going to make this async as well. So this is going to be an async, a kind of fun .NET thing. You never really want to do async void. You always want it to be async task, so you don't run into any kind of like deadlocks or anything like that. But at this point, what we want to do is await Foxhound data dot save changes async. So what this just did was created a bunch of blogs, added it to our little in-memory database, and saved those changes. And we'll debug this if you're confused, and we'll step through and see exactly what it's doing. So now I want to arrange the thing that I'm testing, which is going to be the handler, and I'm going to do a fixture dot create, and I'm going to create that handler itself, which is going to be the which one are we doing? The get all blogs query handler. So let's talk about this for a second. So this get all blogs query handler accepts an iFoxhound data, but maybe it accepts an iLogger, and maybe accepts a bunch of other things over time. You don't want to have to come back in your tests and, you know, if I had var handler equals new get all blogs handler, and I can explicitly pass in Foxhound data here, and that would work, right? But the problem with that is if I come back and refactor this to say, well, now this thing also needs an iLogger, it doesn't matter. Well, now this breaks, right? I have to come back into all my tests that might have this and say, oh, now I need to get some sort of iLogger in here. And that's really not great. So what fixture allows it to do is have that create method, which will say anything that I've set up appropriately, it can inject that in for me. So I think I walked through that probably really fast. Is there any questions on that? So here I have that. So instead of new Foxhound data here, there's a couple of ways I could do that. I could do a fixture.freeze, which would freeze that, called freeze that, which would then get injected anywhere that it would find that signature. But in this case, what I'm going to do is explicitly inject it. And then we can, again, come back and refactor that if we want. So I'm going to do, Tom, do you remember the syntax? It's like fixture.inject, and then I want to inject the Foxhound data.
That's it.
This might explicitly have to be an iFoxhound data though for that to work. So we'll debug this if you're confused. We'll step through it and we'll see exactly what it's going to do. So at this point, I have my handler set up and ready to go. So I can call my handle method on it, right? So here I'm just going to say var result. This is the act. I'm going to await the handler dot handle, and I need to pass it a request, right? So for the sake of this, I'm just going to do new get all blogs query, and then it needs a cancellation token. I could do cancellation token dot none or new cancellation token or something like that, but another opportunity to show another, I think this is a mock feature. You can say it dot is any cancellation token. And what that will do is say, just give me any, I don't care what the cancellation token is, just give me one. Because in this case, I don't really care what it is. So now our result is going to be a list of blog result, right? And now we can assert, I think all we were going to do here is just assert that we got the right count. So we can just say assert. Tom, is the code for this the same?
No, it's going to be slightly different. Like you still have your assertions, but
Can I just do equals or something?
equals, yep. It's actually equal, yeah.
So it wants to know the expected value. So the expected value would be the blogs that we added, and I'm just going to say the count for now. And then the actual is going to be the result dot count. So I think that should work. So I'm going to go ahead and just run this test real quick, and then I'm going to see if it works, and if it does, we'll come back and we'll step through it and see exactly what's going on. So there we go. Test runs. So I guess let me ask you that: is there interest in stepping through and debugging this and kind of like diving deeper, or is this? Do you guys know all this stuff already, and this is just kind of like a refresher? I'm not opposed to either.
I mean, I think it makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah. The only other thing I was hoping, even just to talk through, is kind of what does the assert look like before we change the command to return an int, and we had it just return the task value. What does that assert look like in the end? Or what are you really attempting to test against for unit tests that would have the return be a task.value?
Yep. So in that case, and we'll go write this because the assertions are actually pretty much going to be the same. The assertion is going to be that at the end of the day, I have the blog in my database, right? You might have a separate test that also verifies that the blog ID was returned, right? So let's write that one because that's probably a more interesting test. But before we shift gears to the command, the other test that I would write in here would probably be one that actually verifies that mapping happened as well, right? Like given the blogs, though, I actually get blog results where the maps happened appropriately. So I would have another test for that. And just to refactor this, because if we do continue to add to this, and maybe somebody wants to pull this down and write that test and submit a PR or something for it, Tom, you said I can have a constructor for this.
Right. Yeah, anything you do in a test init, you can do in the constructor here.
Okay.
And then if you have any cleanup, you would do it. You'd implement iDisposable and do it in your dispose.
Oh, perfect. So that's going to fix this problem for us too. So I'm going to do that real quick because traditionally, like all of this code, you wouldn't really have here because you probably want to use it for like this entire little test suite that we're writing. So I would have that in like a test init function that you're going to ensure that you get a new one for every test that's run. So I'm just going to like do a quick refactor of this where I'm going to pull this up here. I'm probably going to have a couple of private class level variables like iFixture, fixture, maybe the data itself, iFoxhound data, and maybe even the DB context options of Foxhound data. And then here I can just do something like DB context options is that, Foxhound data is that, given that. Before I do any of that, I want fixture setup. This customization can happen for all the tests, and I'll inject this Foxhound data everywhere. This field is always assigned before it's being used. I don't think that's true. So now my test becomes a little bit cleaner, and I'm set up to write other tests. So if I were to check that that still runs, we'll run it. And the test still passes. Any questions? I'm not sure what this is. Oh, it just wants these to be read on. Sure. See why it's not okay right now. I might want that. Okay. So yeah, let's do the we'll write the quick test for the command as well. So this,
John, what was this dispose going to be for?
what's that?
What were you going to use dispose for?
So when we had this new Foxhound data in the method itself, so what was happening is this implements DB context, which if I deconstruct here, if it lets me do it, this implements iDisposable. So what that means is it was saying you weren't ever disposing of that thing appropriately, right? So when I just had it in this method, it was just kind of hanging out there. Now that I have it in a constructor, it's actually going to dispose when the class is torn down, so it's not going to complain about that.
So that's automatic.
That's going to happen automatically, yep. But if you did have some state or something that you were keeping around and you wanted to dispose it, Tom, it sounded like if I just had this class implement iDisposable, and then just, if I implement iDisposable, I have to have a dispose method, you know, just to show you here, implement the dispose pattern, finish. I'm going to get this method here, right? And this is where I could tear down whatever I wanted. But I'm not going to do that. Does that answer your question?
I have a question.
Yep.
Is there a concept of like an initializer that happens before every test and versus one that happens before all tests? I know that's a paradigm in some testing frameworks.
So so like in I'm used to MS Test myself, and that has like you can give it like a test init decoration or attribute, and it will run that. Tom, from what I'm understanding from you, is this will run every time?
Yeah, before every test, you'll get a new instance of this, and it'll execute the test.
So that's before every test?
Yes.
Is there one that does before all tests? Like before all tests in the suite?
I don't think so.
Okay.
That's interesting. Is there
just curious.
I'm trying to think of a reason I would want something for all tests. Maybe if I wanted
that's what I'm trying to think of too, right?
Like if you wanted this database name to be the same for all of them for whatever reason, I think you could have like a private class variable or something that might do that for you.
Okay. I was just curious. I've seen that paradigm in other languages or frameworks, and just didn't know if that existed here.
Yeah, I'm sure that's something we can look up. Let's see what it's doing. Okay, so for here, I'm going to just copy and paste this for the ease right now. But we'll call this create blog command handler test. I clicked yes, didn't I? Okay. So now we have kind of a shell of that. So let's see what we're testing on that one. So here we're going to get a command in, and we're going to create a new blog. We're going to add it to the database, and we want to make sure it got in the database. And then to Tim's point, whether this returns unit or the blog ID, we'll see how we can handle that. So the best way to maybe do that is, let's see. I'm just thinking here for a minute, make sure I do this the best way. So what we're going to do is, maybe what we're going to test here is the handle method again. We're going to say something like, I don't know, with request or something like that, with create blog command. Adds blog to database. That's what we want to test. The best way to do that. So now we have this injected. We should be able to. So we're going to have a database. We're going to have nothing in that database. It's going to be empty, and we're going to add a blog to it. And we want to see if that blog is in it. So let's start by comment some of this out. And we're going to have a handler, which is a get blog command handler. Nope. Create blog. Command handler. And then when we call handle, what do we need to give it? Well, it's looking for the command itself. So up here in the arrange, we're going to build one of those. So we're going to say our command is a new, what do we call that? Create blog command. So what we could do here is we could say create blog command, and then we could do command.owner equals, some gibberish. But what we can leverage fixture for is we could say var command equals fixture, and we can use dot create, and we can say create blog command. And now we're going to get the owner with some gibberish already filled in for us. So now we have the handler that we've created, and now we want to pass that command to the handler. And here our result's going to be the int, but that's not necessarily what we're testing right now, so I'm just going to kind of ignore the result. And we want to make sure that that got put into our database. So in order to do that, I'm going to write a using statement. So I'm going to say using var foxhound data equals new foxhound data. I'm going to pass it the options that we have up above. And I'm going to say our var result should be await foxhound data dot blogs dot find async, and our ID should be now what's the best way to do that? I guess I want to find all. I think I just want to go get it out of the database and then just check that it's there. Anyone think of a good way of doing that? So just thinking off the top, like there should only be one in that database, right? Because we haven't had anything else in there. So we should just get that one blog back. And what we should be able to do within there is just assert that all the properties are what we expect them to be.
Are you guaranteed that if you have multiple tests that they will run in a particular order?
I don't know if we necessarily care that they run in a particular order. If every
Well, if you're
okay.
Oh, I guess you are creating a new database per test, right?
Right. So here, like, we haven't leveraged that one, right? Like, we haven't leveraged this thing up here. The reason that you want to do a using here is, say we added a bunch of stuff to it. Well, of course it's going to be there because it's the same instance of it. This ensures that you get a new instance of the database, but it's going to be the same GUID, and so like the same database name. So we're going to create like a new one as if it were a brand new request, and then try to pull that out.
Okay.
So for now,
So given that the constructor runs before every test,
Mhm.
is there a need to instantiate a new Foxhound data object there? Wouldn't it be fresh anyway?
in this case, yes, you would be okay. But if you had a
Okay.
test where you were like inserting something and then like maybe checking the update, if you don't have this using, you didn't necessarily test that the save changes async was called,
Okay.
because it's going to be in the same instance of Foxhound data.
Okay.
I can demo that if we write like an update statement, and you can see where I could come in here and remove the statement and my test would still pass. That's what this using is allowing you to do.
Okay.
So what do I want to assert here? Let's see. At a minimum, I expect that the command owner is the same as the result owner, right? And maybe I expect that the ID is not 0. So is there like a true or something in here? I'm just not familiar with the XUnit stuff. Yeah, we'll try that. I'm going to say it's true that the result.log ID is greater than 0. And maybe I can assert, now the time's difficult because we're using datetime.now, which is not great. But I'll just assert that it's not null. Result.created date. I don't think it could be null anyway. I don't know, what's a good way we could test that it's, I'm just not going to do it. What's this complaining about? Don't want to do that. So let's see, if I run this test, and then I'll debug it as well. So our test passed. So just to kind of show you what this one's doing, if I debug the test here, I'll even put a breakpoint in here. So remember how we said we got our command? So if we come inspect this, you can see that our owner is, owner and some GUID. It's just some dummy data. We create the handler. We step into the handler. So we're getting that same request here. So we've now created a blog that has blog ID 0, the created date, the owner, whatever. Add the blog, save changes, return the blog ID. Come back here, we get our result back from the database, which is going to be that blog ID 1, and you can see the rest, the owner and the created date are there, and the blog ID was 1, so our asserts pass. So pretty straightforward. I mean, I kind of find myself writing a lot of code that ends up looking like that. You obviously have to kind of think through, like, hey, what am I testing? What do I want to make sure actually happened there? But Tim, does that answer your question?
Yeah. I've just seen very different strategies online, and it sometimes seems difficult to find someone that fully trusts what they're actually testing is making sense with Mediatr. So yeah, this made a lot of sense.
Good. So if we wanted to do, maybe we'll just have another test that's going to be almost identical, and we're going to say with command returns blog ID. This is almost going to be the same. I want to create a command, I want to create a handler, but I now know I get a result back. I can still do this using, I mean, it's almost going to be the same as this test, but actually I don't even care necessarily that it did that. So my assert in this point would just be is true, the result is greater than 0. So if I were to run this test, I've mocked out my database and everything, but you know, I'm still getting a blog ID back. That's because it, you know, it injected this automatically for me. So when it got to these lines of code, it was able to, you know, save all that, get a blog ID, and return it. And then here, we get 1. Make sense?
Yep.
So what else, guys? We have 25 minutes or so left in the scheduled appointment. We can keep working on this stuff. We can shift directions a little bit. We can go back and talk about anything that we did. I'm going to push all this stuff to the server. What are you guys thinking? Is that making sense from like why I would use Mediatr, and you know, can you envision some projects that you're on that might make sense or might help you in certain ways?
I'm enjoying it so far. Yeah.
Now I know one of the things that I'm not super familiar with is like the GraphQL stuff, where that's a little bit different of a paradigm. I'm not entirely sure where Mediatr might fit into that. I think it still might have its place, maybe for some of the commands and things.
I was actually going to say, so we use GraphQL on stats, and actually, so I thought, so it does fit in perfectly fine. Like GraphQL is just like REST, right? It's just a way to expose your data. So
right.
The Mediatr pattern would work, except for the part with commands not returning things. It's pretty standard in GraphQL to return, you know, fully hydrated objects.
Okay.
As part of I guess the equivalent of a command.
Okay.
So that would be the only thing that would be interesting.
Right. So in this case, would like this create blog command like return a blog or return like a blog result or something?
Exactly.
Yep. I personally, I think that would probably be okay. I mean, like you're still getting your separation there, and it's still changing the, you know, your commands still change the state of the system regardless if it returns it or not, where the queries don't. And I think that's where the big wins are. Like a real world example that we've come across in the past is we had a system that the reads were becoming pretty slow because of like the giant graph of data that had to pull back. So what we were able to do was create like the equivalent would have been like an iFoxhound read data and an iFoxhound write data. And on the read data, we could, in Entity Framework, turn off some of the change tracking and some of the other stuff that kind of will slow down Entity Framework in larger data sets when you have to pull back a ton of data. And in all my queries, I can enforce that I always get the, you know, read version of it, and in all the commands, I always get the write version of it. So that's been, you know, kind of a powerful way of doing that without having two separate databases. So what else, guys? I mean, do you want to keep going with these? Do you want to end early?
Were we planning on throwing like Swagger on top of the API?
Yeah, we could do that.
And that might be a nice short thing to kind of round out the time here.
Sure. So that's one I haven't done off the top of my head in a while, but I think we can, like, their docs are pretty straightforward. So Swagger, for those of you that don't know, is we can put that on top of our API, and actually just like this little service state thing that I was running, it will give you that, but also show you all of your API methods that are within the API that you're building. And then you can also generate Swagger JSON files off of that, where if we had some like API management tools, which we're actually working on getting, you can provide it that JSON file, and then everybody can go look and see like what your API is providing, which is pretty nice. So I just want to find like a Swagger example. .NET Core. There's just a couple of, I just don't know the syntax off the top of my head to get that in there. Yep, need that, that, and that, and that. Okay, so I think this will be pretty straightforward. So what we'll do is we'll add the NuGet package for this, which is, I think it's Swashbuckle Swagger. Let's see what Swagger gets us. Yep, so I think I need that, and I think I actually need the UI project too, right? I'm going to install both. I'm actually going to install all three. I think I need the gen too. Okay, so we've added Swagger to our API project, and then there's just a little bit of setup to do in the configure services for it. So let's go to startup and configure services, and this is where we're going to say the order here shouldn't matter. So I'm going to do services, and I'm just copying and pasting this directly from their website. And then my API will change with Foxhound API, and we'll leave version 1. And then in the configure, pull some of these together. I think I want to add this earlier in the pipeline. I'm going to put it here. And this is use Swagger. And then later in the pipeline, I think after authorization and the HTTP redirection, I want to actually, they have it here in the docs. And I'll copy and paste that in. I think that's all we need to do. So if I spin this up and I go to Swagger, we now get this, which is really nice, right? So I can say blogs get all, I can say try it out, and I can click execute, and it's actually going to call that method, and like I was doing in the browser, but you get it all right here. And same with the create, which is I can again click try it out, and I can say, you can just edit this. I can say, I missed Tommy, execute, and you can see I got the ID of 6 back. So if I came back up here and ran this again, we should see that one that we just added. So that's pretty nice, right? Like you just kind of get that for free, and then like the magic that it creates behind the scenes for you. I think if I go to like just swagger.json, this. Too many slashes. Here it is. So it generates this JSON file for you, if we were to look at like the raw input of it. And what you can do with this now is take that JSON and give it to, like I said, different API management software that can then understand what your API does and give some visibility about what APIs exist like in your organization. So if we were all to start doing this at work, as we kind of get more and more of like an API ecosystem together, and we all use Swagger or some other standard open API library like Swagger, and we get these JSON files, once we do get that API management software, we can register all of that there. Because that's kind of one problem we have now is like just discoverability of things, and this kind of greatly helps with that. It's pretty nice what it can tell you too. Like, here's the result, here's what I expect back, here's the command, here's what I expect to send it. That's a good thought, Tom.
Easy to set up too.
Yeah, I will tell you at work, it not as great. When you deploy, somehow our servers are locked down in such a way that you can't get to this endpoint. So I've spent countless hours trying to figure that out and eventually just gave up on it. But it does work really nice locally, even in the fence. Any questions about that? I mean, we literally ran through that in like 5 minutes. So maybe we'll take the last 15 minutes and kind of talk about where you want to go next then. I guess I'll ask again, are we still finding these beneficial to do as a group?
I think so.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some of the things that you guys have been doing, is this just trying to get a gauge, like, is this refresher, is this brand new, is it somewhere in between?
I imagine.
I would say in between.
Okay. Are you liking the pacing and everything of it? Is it kind of too fast, too slow?
No, I think it seems good.
Okay. So what we can do is I'll go submit a pull request for all this out there. Someone can go approve it, and then if you want to pull it down and you want to add your own Mediatr queries or commands to it and submit a pull request back, I mean, feel free. I think we can take all that time as training, especially if you're looking to learn some of that stuff. And if we actually want to define like what it is we want to build here, we could spend a couple of minutes like going and adding some tasks out there if people wanted to pick anything up or felt like doing anything on the project.
Can we take another look at maybe that agenda you had to see if what things we haven't hit on in terms of the API?
Sure.
So like cores was in there. I don't know. That'd be probably something once we have a UI would make more sense to talk through cores. But
yeah, definitely will. Let's see. We talked about Git. I think we did all this relatively basic, just getting the API working. We added the static code analysis. We added the API. We talked to SQL Server. Did a migration.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of is some kind of like command validation, that kind of stuff is the only thing we might not have hit on yet.
Yeah, that's a good point. Let me. I think I'll just kind of keep working out of this thing. So. I don't think we're going to get to that in 15 minutes. I wouldn't want to run through that.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, I just meant for a future session.
Yes, certainly. And then obviously like the React stuff, that's something I'm kind of eager to get into and learn a bit more myself. I know enough to get some projects spun up and kind of get everything talking. So, I did kind of create this project out here within GitHub. So if there were things we wanted to do, we could just add them here, like add fluent validation, stuff like that. So that pull request, I think I synced everything back to the server, so I'm going to create a new PR for that. if someone wants to go approve that at some point, and then I'll merge all that back in there so everybody can pull it down. I did on our Teams page, for what it's worth, too. I'll pull this over. I put a tab for the GitHub repo, so it's you can kind of get to everything here if you didn't remember the URL. It'll be right up in here. Yeah. Anything else, like what? Actually, while we're talking about that, anything else you would want to touch on a future meeting?
I'll think some over the weekend. I don't imagine we'll be having anything tomorrow since it's Friday, but it does seem like a good ending point to maybe start pushing towards React next week.
Okay.
Since we'll be the weekend and we'll kind of come in fresh and maybe change pace a bit.
Right. So how about you guys want to regroup on Monday then? And maybe we'll do another session.
Yeah, Monday works.
Do you want to do the same time, like 2 to 4? Or we could do like 10 to 12?
2 does not work for me, and I believe it wouldn't work for Yoy as well.
Yeah, that's right.
Stats meeting then.
Okay. So maybe 10 to noon?
That would be better for me personally.
For me as well.
Okay. Well, speak up if that doesn't work out. I'll schedule it, and then we'll regroup there. Maybe get into some of the React stuff and some of the cores issues, or maybe talk about the Fluent validation if that's what we want to do too.
That sounds good.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess that's all I got. If there's any other comments or anything, feel free to reach out afterwards. I'll be here. All right,
sounds good. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Talk to you guys later.
All right. Bye.
Thanks much.
Okay.